Hello, everybody. I'm Leticia Person, your MC for today's movie night. Very excited to see you all here. So, I'm a manager on our oil and gas team here at Ceres, and you probably all know that. But Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit organization working with influential investors and companies from really around the world on some of the most critical sustainability challenges we face, from the climate and water crisis to the protection of human rights throughout the global workforce. So I'm very happy to welcome you all tonight. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You can state your name, your affiliation, where you're located in the world, and whatever else you would want to share with the whole group tonight. And then throughout the night, feel free to interact with one another in the chat. We would really be happy to see you all communicate with one another and share your insights. So welcome to our movie night. This movie night is one of 3 community events leading up to our annual Ceres 2021 conference. And tonight we are screening, as you all know, the 22-minute short film Water Warriors. This film boasts many accolades, including the Best International Environmental Documentary Short in 2018 from the Green Film Network. And Water Warriors is the story of a Canadian community's successful fight to protect their water from the oil and natural gas industry. So yeah, I said successful, that's a bit of a spoiler, sorry. And we are really honored tonight to be joined by Nipewi Kakinuzit, an Indigenous youth activist who participated in the resistance effort that is depicted in the film. So we will sit down with him after the film to discuss his role along the process, what the Indigenous community is looking for when vetting new projects today, and what you, investors, companies, policymakers, NGOs, could do to support them in that. Additionally, very grateful to be joined also by some of our partners from the Ceres networks. Tonight we have François Mélache from EQUO and Jennifer Cockburn from BNEF joining us. They will speak to their work and I hope also to the complementarity of approaches between the work they're doing, what advocates, policymakers, and others are doing around sustainability challenges. So, although we are all gathered virtually, unfortunately, we would like to pause for a land acknowledgement. So Ceres would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all of the lands that we are on today, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can, each in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you. So before we start with the movie, I just wanted to give you a preview of our night. Just after the screening, we'll have a discussion with Nipewi, followed by some time for you all to ask questions related to the movie. Then we'll have a discussion with François and Jennifer before a general Q&A session. So yeah, that means that you'll have 2 opportunities to ask questions, one first around the movie and then a more general one linked to the discussion that we will have. Now, please just settle in, grab some popcorn and a glass of whatever drink you like. And without further ado, please enjoy the film Water Warriors. See you in 20 minutes. Right, welcome back everyone. I hope you enjoyed the film. And as I'm quoting someone from the end of the film here saying that we have to keep acting. So we'll move on directly to the rest of the discussion. Please feel free to put any questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce you to Nipewi, who participated in the resistance effort depicted in the film. So Nipewi Kakinuzit is a Cree from the Sucker Creek First Nation in northern Alberta. And he was born and raised in Prince George in British Columbia. He's the co-founder and provincial media relations officer for Idle No More, British Columbia. And he has done extensive work in BC and Canada as a Treaty 8 hereditarian or urban Indigenous leader. Sorry. So Nipewi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really glad to have you here. And I'm sure you'll introduce yourself again, but I wanted to ask you at the same time, maybe your title is hereditary or urban leader. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that entails and your current advocacy efforts?
Well, first I'd like to start off with acknowledging that I am coming to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations here in Victoria, so-called British Columbia. I will answer that question in two parts because that question is a two-part question. Hereditary leaders are individuals who were part of the leadership of their communities before colonization, before treaty signing, before entering into the agreements with the Crown that we did. And I come from one of those families from Treaty 8 in Sucker Creek First Nation in Alberta. As an urban leader, that comes from my work with Idle No More British Columbia, having represented urban communities throughout BC and across Canada. So I hope that answers the question there in terms of the differences between hereditary leaders and urban leaders. And so I fall into both categories because of the work and the family that I come from.
It does, thank you. And could you tell us a little bit more about the role that you took during that advocacy effort that we saw in the film just right now? Did you maybe, I'm really interested in knowing if you had any specific conversations with other stakeholders that were involved in the process, be it investors, policymakers, the media, the police, yeah.
Absolutely, and so I was part of a caravan of people that traveled from Vancouver, British Columbia to New Brunswick to support our relatives, the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, the Wollastoq people who were in opposition to this project going forward. I had a role with the individuals on the ground in terms of acting as liaison between the police and with the nation in terms of helping to provide security and to act as a witness in those interactions, as there were some interactions that required another set of eyes on the interactions. And so that's primarily the role I served in at my time on the front lines in New Brunswick, as well as acting as a representative for the West Coast nations to be a witness. In coastal West Coast cultures, there are protocols around witnesses and having representatives being witness to these actions. And so the West Coast nations of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish sent myself and others as representatives to be witness to what was going on during that time. In terms of shareholders, stakeholders, industry, CEOs, executives, we had no interactions with them. There were some interactions between some of the clan mothers and the other leadership in the early days, but in terms of how that went on during my time there in the winter months, there was really no interaction between industry and us on those lines. It was just primarily with the RCMP and some representatives of the on-the-ground workers.
Great. Thank you. And I would like to ask you maybe a bit more generally now, when the Indigenous community is looking at new projects, mostly energy projects, I would say, in the context of our discussion today, what are they looking for when vetting the pros and cons of those projects? What are they taking into account? What are you really looking at? Are you against all new developments? You know, how is that Okay.
Well, that's a couple questions right there in and of itself, but I'll address the first thing that you asked. So in terms of what it is we're looking at when these projects are coming forward, well, it comes down to a number of things. The social, economic, environmental, political, and cultural impacts that that's going to have on our communities, not even just in the here and the now, but 7 generations moving forward. And if those costs are too high, then we don't consider the project, because everything we do is with that forward thinking of how is this going to impact the next generations? How is this going to impact my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, my great-great-grandchildren? So that's why oftentimes when we don't see that component in these projects is why we refuse to engage on those projects. It's not to say that we're opposed to development, but we're opposed to development being dictated to us, which this documentary highlights that all of those actions wouldn't have taken place had industry just taken the time to come and consult like they should have at the beginning.
Great, thank you. And so you just talked about the 7th generation principle, which was also a strong theme, I think, from the film. And so that's really the fact that you are thinking about the impacts of all activities 7 generations forwards, but also 7 generations back. And I would say that, this has quite interesting parallels with investor fiduciary duty of loyalty, impartiality, sorry. Why do you think investors should care about Indigenous rights when it comes to sustainable development, and long-term returns? Do you see links between the way you're thinking and the way investors should or could think about those issues?
Well, I'll just state for the record here in Canada that it's not something that they should consider. It's a legal requirement that they consider our rights as Indigenous people as they move forward with all of these projects. Furthermore, I'll even say that in upholding Indigenous rights, what you're really doing is upholding human rights, and you're also upholding the rights of the environment, the water, the air, the land, and the earth. Because when you look at it, Indigenous populations of this world, although we only account for 1.23% of the world's total population, we're protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity. So that should be a strong indicator of why we need to protect Indigenous rights, because again, it's human rights that we're really talking about by this. And that should be self-evident in terms of how that affects the bottom line, because when the Indigenous people of the countries that you're dealing with are thriving, then really everybody's thriving. But we're not willing to do that as Indigenous people at the cost of what we were talking about before, the cost of the 7 generations that are coming ahead of us, as well as the work that the 7 generations before us did.
Very clear, thank you. And maybe I'm curious, have you experienced any example of stakeholder dialogue or community participation that you think were really best practice and that you think other investors or companies could look up to?
Well, I was part of an economic development youth summit in 2018, 2019 that took place on the Enoch First Nation that was hosted by Candu. It's an economic development officers organization that's based here in Canada. And so they had us do a group project where we had to do a proposal for a proposed project within a nation. Now, it's funny because the case study that we did was based on my nation, Sucker Creek, but they made it smaller. But as we did that presentation, we also had representatives from all the major banks, RBC, TD, Bank of Montreal. And in that presentation, at least my group's presentation, we took first place in that competition, because it was a competition. We highlighted the fact that in our proposal that before we did anything, that we went right to the nation, we went to the elders, we went to the knowledge keepers, the culture keepers, and we said to them, what are the concerns that you have that we need to take into consideration as we're writing this proposal? And that resonated with those shareholders and the nations that were present in that room, because that was really the first time any of them have ever heard that before. Anybody coming forward and saying, you know, what are your concerns as we're writing this project? And so not only did we put that forward, but it was also received and heard by those shareholders in the room. And we had people coming up to us afterwards, you know, thanking us for, you know, putting that in their mind of, hey, you know, you're right, we should be going to these people before anything, and, you know, speaking with them, getting their understanding of what they need, because there's no one clear roadmap to this. Each nation is going to have their own criteria, their own wants, their own wills, their own desires. And so if you are engaging in this work with the nations, you have to understand that one nation is going to have different wants, wills, and desires than the other. So really what I'm saying is there's no one roadmap that's going to, you know, be the silver bullet to get to yes. And also, you shouldn't be trying to get to yes. It should be respecting the consent of the nations if they say yes and if they say no.
Well, thank you, and well done also on your work. They're really inspiring. And so you were talking about banks just right now. I'm wondering, are there any other pressure points that you have found to be complementary to the efforts that you are doing with the whole Indigenous community, like with banks, as you were saying, related to financing some projects, or with the media, or some movies, as the one we just saw when it comes to communication, other end goals, maybe like any effort that you found complementary to what you're doing here?
Well, I would say that the best tool that we've had in this discussion, in these conversations, has been the on the ground, you know, as we like to refer it in the Indigenous community, the moccasins on the ground that cause for the push. Now, my time with Idle No More, that was one of the big things that, you know, quite literally led to what happened in New Brunswick, was, you know, Indigenous youth rising up in the urban centers, in the communities, and saying, you know, we've been going to do whatever we can in order to put pressure on our political representation to start moving in this direction. And having witnessed firsthand, you know, that work on both ends in terms of Idle No More and in terms of the political leadership of this country, you know, it really resonated with them, because they had been waiting, in terms of the political leadership, had been waiting for that political will from the communities to back them in those boardrooms. But at the same time, it was folks coming into those positions from the grassroots, being allowed to be in those rooms to start to bring these questions up, that really put it on the political leadership to start to advocate for these positions and these points of view. But again, that was just one tool. It has to be coming from multiple fronts. It has to be coming from multiple areas, not just political leadership, but hereditary leadership stepping up in the communities and voicing the wants, wills, and desires of their communities as well. So it has to be a step-by-step, multi-phased approach that takes multiple points of contact into consideration, at least from my point of view.
Yeah, very clear. Of course, I would say. And right, we just have 2 minutes left before the Q&A. So I wanted maybe to give you that time to, you know, we have here an audience of investors, companies, NGOs, policymakers. What is the main takeaway message that you would want to give to our audience today?
Well, I would say first and foremost that each and every one of you in this room who does business in North America needs to understand that each and every one of you has Indigenous partners that you should and need to be working with, whether you recognize that or not. That would be the big takeaway from this, is all of what you saw in the video could have been avoided had these companies just simply recognized and acknowledged who needs to be talked to, who needs to be spoken to, and who needs to be engaged from the onset. And, you know, you may not get a yes, but just simply doing that work will allow for those conversations to take place, and you will be more likely, at least in my opinion, to get a yes. But again, as I said, you should believe that if you do this certain steps, that you will get a yes. It's just being open to this idea that, you know, again, with consent, if it's a no, then it's a no. But if it's a yes, then, you know, go ahead.
Well, nice. Thank you so much, Nipowi, for sharing your insights on that, your experience with all of us. It's really appreciated. And we have received quite some questions from the audience, so I will start with one, and then we'll move forward. We have about 10 minutes for that, and a series of questions, but I think you can go as deep as you want in your answers. So I will read from the question that we got. Thank you for sharing this wonderful documentary. I was wondering if Nipowi can speak to his hopes and expectations for a just transition to greener infrastructure and the role Indigenous communities must hold for it to be successful.
Well, it's my hope and desire that the knowledge keepers, that the traditional culture keepers in our communities are recognized for the knowledge and the expertise that they hold in our traditional lands. We've been living on these lands for thousands of years, and we've learned a thing or two about how to interact with these lands in a good way. It's not to say that, you know, we can't do projects. It's not to say that we can't do development, but we have knowledge and understanding that can benefit that work. You know, there's this myth here in the Americas that when the Europeans came over, that they were walking into this pristine wilderness, which is not the case, as we're seeing more and more as archaeology is showing that we actually did quite a bit of development work on the agriculture and the landscape here in the Americas. But we did it in such a way that, again, when the Europeans came over here, they thought that that was just natural state of the world. But that's what we're talking about when we say, you know, we have knowledge and understanding of how to do that still. It's still held within our communities, but we're not going to freely give that information out. And if you want it, you have to come correctly to our nations, not sending representatives, but you yourself as a CEO or as whatever senior executive position, you come because you're the one that is causing these projects to happen. So you should be the one doing the work to get the consent.
Right, thank you. Can you maybe also talk a little bit more about the reception of the movie, like within your community, but also outside the Indigenous community? Can you, speak a little bit about how it was received?
Well, in my home community, a number of our members have seen this video and they've felt very positive about it. It's highlighted the results of coming together, putting aside our historic grievances and doing what was best for all of our communities. And that's really what many in the Indigenous community have spoken about over the years as this documentary's been out for a couple of years now. And that's been one of the big takeaways, is the fact that it's an example of communities putting aside their historic grievances with each other long enough to address a situation that was clearly going to negatively impact all of them, and how they could go about addressing that in a good way. It was talked about in the video a bit, the election that went on, and I just want to give some feedback on that, because that election, you know, the Liberals did win, and they won because, again, it was an example of the Indigenous, non-Indigenous communities coming together, because they had Indigenous representation in that election of 80%. It's the largest turnout of Indigenous voters in New Brunswick's history in that election. And literally, having talked to community members during that time, they were driving people to the polls. Like, members of the Acadian community were going to reserves and picking up people who had not voted and taking them to the polls to go vote. You know, and that, again, that just highlights, you know, what can happen when communities put their differences aside long enough to do what's best for everybody.
I love that conclusion. Right, we have another question here. Folks, don't hesitate to ask questions in the Q&A box if you have any. But did the company Nipowi try to use Indigenous members of your community to try to convince the community to accept fracking at that time? Or
Based on my understanding, there was a meeting that had taken place on the provincial level. So in Canada, we have the Assembly of First Nations, which is the governing body for the chiefs and on reserve people. And so based on my understanding, there was meetings that was held between that organization in New Brunswick and the nations. And so they had meetings with elders from the community, but there was concern from members of the communities in New Brunswick because it was perceived that some of these people were handpicked in terms of uh, being those voices to advocate for the project. So they essentially, it was felt by the community that elders had been picked along those lines. Now, that's a deeper conversation that the folks in New Brunswick would be better able to speak to, but I will note that Elsie Pogtog and a number of the nations in New Brunswick did actually end up leaving the Assembly of First Nations of Manitoba due to this situation. Now, I can't speak to whether or not they've joined back since then, but based on that time, that is what I know to be the case, that those negotiations did lead to divisions within the political structures of New Brunswick's nations.
all right. And can you speak then a little bit about what is, according to you, the best way to build trust between companies and the Indigenous community?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, coming to our communities before even projects, just come meet us. Like, I mean, that's probably the single biggest thing you could do. It's like, obviously, you know, how would you feel if you had somebody come up to you and just ask you for something? You wouldn't be generally open to that, especially if you've never met them before. But if you meet these people beforehand, you know, you build a relationship with them that's not based on, hey, I want something from you, but hey, I want to build a relationship so we can have a relationship. I think that that more than anything can go towards having that kind of relationship, or later on down the road, then you can start talking about projects. But simply coming to, you know, our nations and you know, giving us a plan and saying, well, this is what we plan on doing, that's not collaboration, that's not consultation, that's dictating to us what you plan on doing. And why would anybody expect a yes out of that? That's my question to, you know, industry. Why would you expect a yes when we've never even met you before?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I have one last question from the Q&A, and then I would like to end up with the last one. We're very short on time, so I'll jump into that. Here, reading the question, thanks for sharing a powerful film. As a leader and activist, how effective do you find documentary films as a tool for change makers?
I would say very effective. This film has been shown around the world. It has actually inspired a number of actions. I know in India and a couple of other countries. It's been a massive tool in terms of uniting communities and showing what can happen when communities, you know, put aside those historic differences long enough to address what's going on in the here and the now. Also, it's been a major tool in terms of fundraising. It's been used for a number of fundraising events right across the country and around the world in terms of advocating for Indigenous and environmental rights. And so I personally feel that it's very effective to create these kinds of documentaries to share with networks across the world.
Great, and that's why we are sharing it today. All right, I would like to end on a last question, which is a little bit broader. Could you let us know what gives you hope in your daily life and with the Indigenous community, all the work you're doing? Where do you find hope?
Well, what gives me hope personally is the fact that we're having conversations like this, where both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous community are understanding where we're at and having partners and allies in those communities who are trying to do this work to bridge those gaps of misunderstanding and miscommunication. I personally feel that if we are to survive as a species, as a people, that we all have to come together and do what we can to better our lives and situations as a whole, as a human society. And that's done by starting these conversations off and, you know, being comfortable with what we're hearing, even when it's opposed to our own worldview, because that's how we learn and grow.
On that note, thank you so much, Nipawi. That was really inspiring and insightful. Thank you for being with us tonight. As you know, we will move now to a short discussion with Francois and Jennifer, but we will come back to you. Oh, not seeing you anymore. Come back to Nipawi during the last Q&A. So remember before that that we will have that second round of Q&A. Please keep those questions coming in. Just down in the chat, feel free to ask any question that you would have. And now we'll move on to the Partners Insight. So I'm very happy to introduce you to Francois Beloche. He's the Director of Corporate Engagement and a founding partner at ECHO. He's in charge of the shareholder engagement process and priorities there. And so Francois is really a pioneer in the area of sustainable development in Quebec. So we are very glad to have you here tonight, Francois. Also glad to work with you a lot within Ceres. So thank you for joining us. And before I'm introducing you, Jen, I will ask Francois, can you tell me a little bit more about your background and the work that you're doing at ECHO, just generally?
Yeah, sure. Sure, thanks. So, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I work with ECHO, so we are a shareholder engagement service provider. So we have clients that are investors, and we speak on their behalf to companies about environmental and social issues. And I've had over the years quite a few contact with oil and gas companies, with mining companies, and in relation to their any issues they were having with First Nations, with Indigenous peoples as well. Elsewhere, for example, in Peru for a few years, talking to oil companies that were in Peru as well. So that's always been a very important topic for me. And I know you, Letitia, a lot from the climate work, so that's another big area. And I think there's a lot of overlaps between both, of course, but quite involved in this as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Francois, for joining us. And I will introduce now Jennifer Cockburn. Thank you, Jennifer, for being with us tonight. So Jennifer heads BNEF's America's Gas Research Team, and she is also really focused on product development for water research and financial valuation of water risk. And then in her personal life, Jen has also launched Sacred Waters, which is a spiritual wellness community with locations in New York and Colorado. So an interesting mix of oil and gas and water here. Thank you so much, Jen, for being with us tonight. And again, I would like to ask you the same question I asked Francois a second ago. Could you tell me a little bit more about your background, the work that you're doing at the intersection of oil and gas and water, not only at BNEF, but also beyond that, maybe?
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm really grateful to be here. And as you mentioned, most of my career was in natural gas analysis and trading, which I left about 6 years ago to found Sacred Waters, and then returned more to the financial side of things a couple of years ago at Bloomberg NEF, where we provide research and data to customers with the intention of helping the world transition more quickly to a cleaner energy economy. And I've also been glad to be able to also look into, as you mentioned, some new type of water research that we could possibly do to help move that conversation forward as well. The intersection is an interesting word, because I actually don't think they intersect very well from a research perspective yet. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of water people doing research and academics doing research on the topic, but it's really the oil and gas industry, in my view, is left out of that, and they aren't. And it's because I think the incentives are not aligned for that. I mean, we can all see, even in the film, that this is one of the toughest industries to change, in my view. The systemic protections, power dynamics, incentives are very fortified. And it's not to say that it's that we shouldn't be working in that intersection. It's just to say that I think we're on the verge, hopefully, of much more movement than we've seen in the past. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Francois. All right, I'll ask you both a few questions separately, and then I have a common question for the both of you at the end. But I'll start with you, Francois. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about how you approach conversations with oil and gas companies on human rights, and if you see any or highlight then any link between human rights and climate? How do you bring that up?
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks. Yeah, and just want to start off by saying I was very moved by the movie, which I hadn't seen, and I think it's you know, a reminder, unfortunately, of the state of certain cases in Canada. There's other cases as well like this, but fortunately, there's also, I think, good examples, and I think. Nepa, we spoke very well about a lot of things that I would like to cover, but just in terms of the way we approach this, I think really I see it from it's taken from an Indigenous people's rights perspective, and I think when I communicate and start engaging with companies that are exposed to that issue. Well, first thing is to really try to identify myself and contact local communities and local First People. But on the other side is really to have a conversation on the policies the company would have, and the way they perceive or integrate Indigenous peoples into their policies, and in particular on FPIC, on free, prior, and informed consent. So how do they view this consent, and really dig into a bit of the detail, like what do they mean by consent, who can give consent, and then what to do in cases where there isn't a clear governance, for example, within a community or an area, and whether there is already existing structures or not. I think that's a big one. It's in a way, it's tempting to say that when there is when the conditions are there for FPIC, I mean, it's easier for a company to operate in an area where the conditions are there. And in Canada, there's a number of modern treaties. Again, others could speak much better than this than me, but I think it's good for viewers to know that there is a number of these treaties out there, and you know, many of them have been in place for a number of years, covering mining activities, oil and gas, forestry, and you know, they cover a lot of issues that could be of a source of problems, starting with just the granting of exploration rights or mining, and overseeing the water management and royalties, taxes, and how to continue negotiating and all that. So I think, you know, when addressing a company on FPIC, the first thing is really to understand the context where they're operating, and then I guess getting into a bit of details. You know, in Canada, there's a number of sectors, extractive sectors, but also energy, that have had a history of issues. A big one is pipelines, as you probably know. You know, the two big ones, TC Energy and Enbridge, have been historically, you know, engaged with a number of First Nations, but a lot of controversies and ongoing controversies. So that's part of some of the discussions I'm having with these companies, is really trying to get beyond their intents and really getting into the details of whether they're consulting and engaging in meaningful dialogue, and yeah, And there's a number of they've both TC Energy and Bridge have both issued report recently on this topic. So I think there's they're obviously well aware that this is an issue, but it's still a hard conversation to have, I would say. So that's kind of in a nutshell. But and on the human rights, I think we're definitely, as investors, we need to we put that in the framework of human rights, because we're asking companies to respect human rights. And as an investor, we also have a responsibility to respect human rights. And that's being more and more understood that way. And so I think we need to, for our beneficiaries, but for our own clients, but also for it just makes sense to respect human rights even from a business perspective.
Yeah, thank you, François. Thank you for those insights. Maybe I'll ask a question to Jen, and then we'll see how much time we have left. But Jen, could you maybe tell me a little bit more about the trends that you're seeing around valuing water in the work that you're doing? Like, do you get questions from investors or companies about that? And what do you think, like on the opposite side of that, what questions do you think investors should ask companies, oil and gas companies, obviously related to water? Do you think, is there a link there somewhere that you're making?
Sure. So I'll answer sort of big picture first and then come back to oil and gas. I think the two trends around valuing water are, one, right now the value in most places is seen as the cost it takes to obtain the water, which is generally free or very low, which is changing slightly in more recent years. And then the other sort of front on valuing water is the idea of valuing the risk of either running out of water or having some type of environmental disruption due to rising sea levels or other things. And they're really separate questions, I think, but both touch on the value of water. There is a lot of important work going on around water footprinting, so how much water is actually going into products or activities. But all of that is really in, I would say, other industries outside of oil and gas, which is really stuck in how much is the water that I'm using costing me, and relative to other expenses, it's very, very low. So I think for now, the edge of growth in oil and gas and the questions to be asking of oil and gas companies is focusing on efficient operations. And so this question, separate from the work that NEPA did, which the film pointed out was before operations started, which is a really important other place. This is once operations have started somewhere by a company, then I think the push is to have them be more efficient. And I pulled a little bit of the data that Bloomberg has on ESG disclosures before tonight, and looked at just the 50 companies in the S&P's Oil and Gas Producers Index and what they have disclosed most recently. And some of them aren't disclosing at all still. And there are even some in that index that are disclosing 100% of their water uses from freshwater withdrawals, 0% of that being recycled. Meanwhile, as a comparison, some of the better performers on these metrics have used 20 to 40%, I'd say, is the first threshold, first tranche of fresh water in their activities, and 100% of that recycled. And this isn't even talking about the issue of fracking fluids, the chemicals that are inside of them, how hard the industry fights against disclosing what fracking fluids are inside of them, and in some cases winning protection of those as trade secrets. So all of that, I think, is where the movement is right now. I think the incentives in the system, again, are only on the front of what are our peers doing, and the idea of doing the right thing, which everybody gets, but we know, I think, is not so easy sometimes under capitalistic systems to actually get everyone to do the right thing. So I think, again, the edge of that is really on efficiency with water first.
Great, very interesting. I could listen to you all for hours. Okay, maybe Francois, I'll just come back to you for a minute, if you can be brief, and then jump back to Jen. So Francois, you've spoken about the investor's duty to respect human rights just a second ago. Can you elaborate a little bit on that duty, and like how does that fit in your overall engagement strategy? I guess also within Climate Action 100 Plus, do you see other investors raising those issues too? How does that fit?
Yeah, well, I think it's just a matter of avoiding infringing on human rights is the main duty, responsibility of companies, and as investors, we need to ensure that we're not involved in those companies. And of course, it's easier said than done. And the issue is really that there's such a lack of information that transpires to investors. If I compare with climate change, right now climate change is being taught by all investors, including mainstream investors, are asking questions to companies about climate change issues. And I was just on listening to the earnings call of TC Energy, and most of the questions were actually on energy transition and how the company will be resilient. But there was no question about the current conflict in BC around one of their pipelines, and that struck me as, there's a lack of understanding by the investing community on human rights and on social issues. Maybe it's a bit harder to measure, and it's always a victim to a different interpretation, whereas climate, it's more clear cut. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, I will move directly to the question that I wanted to ask you both, just to be respectful of the time and mindful of the time. So I would like you both to speak a little bit to the complementarity of approaches between the work that you're doing and what we just witnessed in the movie. And I guess we could start with you, Jen, if you don't mind.
Sure. I wanted to also just say thank you to Nicky, but also all the Indigenous people, communities, and tribes who keep the traditions and ways of relationship with water alive. And I think these wisdom keepers, water carriers, and others understand this right relationship, and they're learning to have this relationship, from a young age. And I think that's what makes all the work that all of us are doing complementary, actually, is that every single one of us here can understand our own relationship to water first, regardless of what role we play in what's going on. Like, do we value water? Do our families value water? And do we even realize that we have a relationship with water yet for some of us? And it's not the shame, taking too long of showers or anything, because there are much bigger problems for water than home use. But it is to bring awareness to the truth, I think, that we each have a different role to play in this transition, as we mentioned, in order to survive. This is at the level of survival. And hopefully we won't get to the crisis point required to force us to change. But I think developing this relationship with water, which each of us can do, the water has the answers actually for what it needs. And we will all be able to collectively figure that out. And this is what I think is not only creating complementarity, if that's a word, amongst us, but actually uniting us to fight the same fight and to move in the same direction. Because even those on the other side of those asset fights or specific project fights understand, that we all need water, that we have these relationships. And I think that's the key, really, to moving forward together.
Yeah, and maybe just add one key element that I take away from the movie is really the solidarity between First Nations and non-First Nation people. That was really amazing to see, and I don't think there's a lot of examples that are so successful like that. And I think with investors, it's just the same. There needs to be more of these coming together. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your insights and experience. So we'll move on now to the Q&A. if any of you in the audience has questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box, as always. But I will start with a few ones. Maybe I'll start with you, Nipawi, because it's been a while and we're missing you. I will read again the question that we got. On the water issues within oil and gas industry, are you seeing any increased focus by state or provincial or federal lawmakers?
In terms of policy?
Yeah, I think policy on water issues within the oil and gas industry.
Well, definitely here in BC with the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, which the provincial government is trying to have enshrined in legislation, it definitely speaks to that, and the right for the nations to have that protected is one of the major sticking points in these conversations. Water sovereignty is big here in British Columbia because of the fact that many of the cultures, many of the nations, many of the ethnic groups, their cultures are based on the water, based on the shared relationship that they have with the creatures that share those water spaces. And so it's definitely a big consideration in moving forward with any of these projects, any of these agreements, anything that we're doing, and how that, again, is going to impact the generations coming up. We've seen the adverse impacts of not taking water into consideration in terms of the Alberta tar sands. I come from a nation that is directly impacted by those lack of considerations from the tar sands. I come from Suck Creek First Nation, and we are downstream of the Athabasca, so we definitely see firsthand in our community the impacts that not taking water into consideration has.
Thank you, Nicky. All right, I'll move on directly with other questions because I see that we have a lot, so I'll just try to keep the rhythm. This question is maybe more for you, Jen. What type of questions do you receive from your end clients on this topic, I guess, water and oil and gas? How are they engaged on this topic in comparison with other environmental or social issues? Can you speak to that a little?
Sure. So I think our ESG data team has seen a big increase as ESG scores first came out. People wanted to know the scores, and now we're moving more towards clients of ours are asking for the raw data to create their own scores. So we see that as a positive movement. Our portfolio managers are beginning to look at this in their own ways and have their own workflows about it. On the waterfront, at least in the US, I think we're quite behind Europe and other places where we see clients sort of when they talk to each other, like, oh, are you using this data? Are you using this data? And right now, the answer is generally no among the big people. I actually think that's why the work Ceres and Francois and others do is so important to hold this kind of accountability among the shareholder engagement. Bloomberg News just put out an article today reviewing a study that shows a large portion of signatories to responsible investing commitments then actually don't go back and vote yes on shareholder resolutions from an environmental perspective. So, like, effectively, they're not quite walking the walk in all cases. But I think, again, people like Ceres and Francois, who are holding the hands and really having accountability, are the ones at the moment pushing that envelope.
Right. We'll continue doing that. Francois, that's another question for you. What type of platform and framework are you utilizing for engagement and consultation with First Nations? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm using a framework. I'm referring to global standards as much as possible. You know, the UN Declaration on Indigenous people's rights, but also anything that would come out from other official governments. But it's really more best standards, best practice standards. You know, IRMA, for example, is a responsible certification scheme that tries to address that and to measure how FPIC is attained or respected. And so, yeah.
Can I jump in actually with one other thing? You reminded me when you said best practices, Francois, that One thing I'm seeing, just I think it's important to acknowledge, is in ESG professionals amongst oil and gas companies, we have a lot of engagement at conferences. Like, they're saying a lot of good things, but whenever I visit clients that are like, sort of in the trenches of those same companies, in some cases on the trading desks or in the project development arms, there is quite a difference in the way they view these issues. So I think one problem that hopefully can change is that this becomes more mainstream within the company, and they can see it as an opportunity for something new and better. And we do have some clients who are leading the way in that regard, that have groups within their companies that are looking at ways to be innovative and ways to be in front of this for the next generation. And so the questions are very varied, I guess is what I wanted to say.
Wow, thank you. I will jump directly to another question to, I think, Nipawi, this one. Do you think companies understand the difference between climate change and climate justice?
That's a good question. I think that even within our communities, that's a discussion that we need to have. What does that actually mean between climate change and climate justice? I know as a hereditary, climate justice has to do with us being at the table and being able to bring forth the firsthand impacts that we're witnessing on our reserves, on our traditional territories, in order to equate that understanding of the climate change that is going on. We're seeing it with our Inuk, brothers and sisters and relatives up north, where they're firsthand, reporting to us the environmental change that are coming because of climate change, and how that translates into environmental justice is the work that we still have to do. But I think that starts by having those conversations and understanding that, we're on the front lines of these impacts, and to greater understand how we get to that justice. Again, it goes to what I've been saying from the very beginning, is just come talk to us and we can start having those conversations. But until those conversations happen, I don't think we'll have that understanding, at least from my point of view.
Right, thank you, Nipawi. All right, I have two other questions for Jen and Francois. I won't be able to ask them all. But Francois, do you have any conversations with the banks or financiers of oil and gas projects to discuss risks? And what are the other pressure points besides investor pressure that you think those companies are feeling?
Yeah. Well, with banks on climate, there's definitely a very live conversation on how banks are or should be or are starting to measure their financed emissions. So the emissions from their lending and investment portfolio, and then how they would reduce those emissions. So that's on the climate side, and also a very live conversation on Indigenous peoples' rights. I think, especially after the Dakota Access Pipeline, controversy and crisis in the U.S. Many banks had been involved in this, and I think it's been there's been a bit of a change. It's not the only factor, but so banks have started to include that. It's just unclear to me, even when they have an Indigenous peoples policy, how that really translate into impact. It's always hard to know how a bank is successful when they have a policy, just because we don't have the details of the results. But yeah, it's definitely part of it. And investors are a bit like banks in a way. We should talk about the financial sector as a whole. Lending, investing. It's all kind of different ways to allocate capital.
Right, thank you. Yeah, of course. Another question to you, Jen. Do you see any data points on the risks to companies that are lobbying against environmental protection?
I don't think this has manifested yet. I personally think it might be coming. and it's starting to be looked at more. I think generally speaking, the change, it's like Greta Thunberg talks about, like the change is happening here, and whether you like it or not. And there are companies very staunchly kind of with their feet in the mud, sort of not wanting to change. And then there are others sort of going along with the flow. But I do think those ones, even the ones that are so stuck, are starting to see some movement. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I don't think yet it has manifested into risk that's mattering to investors or portfolio managers.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll try to have a last question here for you, François. Investors are encouraging companies to engage with community stakeholders on the energy transition. Should investors also be engaging directly with communities impacted by company activities?
Yes, the question is yes. And I think it's a challenge, but it's really a challenge that investors can no longer afford not to take. It's a challenge because it's always complex to engage with a local community, and there is the issue of, you know, yourself, who are you engaging with, and you need to do your own research to ensure that you're engaging with kind of you know, the right people. And but I think the onus is on us to make more effort and to be definitely listening and to engage. But Nepawi might have other ways to do that, because I think it's really a matter of communication, as you said. That's the key, and we're not having enough of that at all. Yeah.
Nepawi, any thought on that?
Yeah, I have to agree. You know, it's a simple matter of doing the homework, you know, finding out who you need to talk to in the communities and just simply going and talking to them. It really is that simple. It's not a complicated matter, you know. There's folks like myself and others who can help facilitate that work, but you need to reach out.
Well, on those words, we'll have to stop here for the Q&A. Thank you so much for your thoughtful answers and taking part in the discussion. Thank you to the audience also for being here with us tonight. I think that we have seen that Ceres is really part of a broader network of stakeholders engaging on key sustainability issues, such as the climate, water crisis, human rights, and there's still a lot of work to do. So I hope this has given you some hope and ideas of where to go next. And also, you know, I think the roles of all of us and all those stakeholders are really additive and complementary. So let's use that as much as we can. And for each new project, engage with local Indigenous communities from the start, value water as much as we can. And yeah, then the world will be saved. So we will discuss this and other issues later again during the Ceres 2021 conference later this month. And I just wanted to highlight here on your screen 4 different sessions that I think will echo a little bit what we have discussed today. The first is the role of boards and investors in the net zero transition, where we will discuss challenges that energy companies face when they want to become net zero businesses. And it will feature the CEO of BP, Bernard Looney. Another session that I would recommend is Leave No One Behind, the Clean Energy Transition, where we will focus on the just transition and also metrics related to success there. So directly related to the discussion we had today. Another session is Valuing Water and what institutional investors can do around that. So we will discuss water-related financial risks and sustainable water practices. Again, very nice link with what we discussed today. And the last one is getting to 100% clean electricity by 2035, where we will explore pathways to a 100% clean energy. So these are just 4 of the, I don't know, more than 30 sessions I think that we will be organizing. So we hope you will join us there. We also hope that you enjoyed this movie night with us. Thank you again so much, François, Jen, and Nepawi for joining us tonight. And really thank you all for from the audience for taking part in the discussion. We really look forward to seeing you again between March 22nd and March 25th at Ceres 2021. So please register if it's not done yet. And in the meantime, take very good care. Thank you all again, and let's continue the discussion and continue the work.